Hey everyone, Rob B here with Rob D, and you are listening to the Property Podcast. Now, when the market is starting to get heated, people get excited and people can make a lot of money, but some people get really nervous as well. What happens if we're at the top of the market? And if we are, should I buy? Well, in this episode, we're going to give you lots of information to work with, but wait to the end because the numbers around investing at the top of the market are really interesting.
Welcome to the Property Podcast, where every Thursday morning property investors come to be informed and inspired. Yes, this week, buying at the top of the market is every investor's greatest fear. But what does the reality actually look like? Well, we're going to be looking at the data, including from our own portfolios, to help you out. And make sure you stick around to the end for Hub Extra, because if it's all getting a bit too much for you, we've got a fantastic resource to help you relax and forget all about it.
So our news story of the week comes from The Guardian, and this is a news headline that I like the look of, Rob. HSBC offers sub 1% mortgage as interest rate war intensifies. Sign me up, Rob. Sounds great.
Yeah, well, if you've got a 40% deposit and you're a residential buyer and you've got a great credit history and you want a 2-year fix with the HSBC, then you are in luck. Because yes, you can now get a mortgage for under 1%. Apparently the last time they offered a rate this low was 5 years ago. And if it was just one product, then it would be kind of interesting, but not that exciting. But the article goes on to talk about lots of other lenders who are also cutting their rates. And it's talking about the competition between lenders, which is something we've talked about a lot in the past, Rob. What happens to the Bank of England base rate is, of course, very important, but also what the lenders are doing and what their appetite is like is extremely important as well. And what we seem to be seeing here is lenders fighting for borrowers and therefore taking their rates down and down and down.
Yeah, long-time listeners to the podcast will know and expect this. We've talked about this happening multiple times, and it is no surprise. And this isn't going to be a one-off. This isn't a fluke. With the market being so strong, lenders are seeing lots of opportunity out there and they want their piece of the pie. So it's great news for those who are looking to borrow. And while this is on a residential property, you normally will find that in time, the rates on buy-to-let products will start to come down as well. It follows a little bit later. So they go after the residential market, but then the buy-to-let market often follows as well. So expect news stories in the not-too-distant future of very competitive buy-to-let rates. So the mortgage market is really hot right now, and as I touched on, the property market is super hot. So next week's market update is going to be a must listen because there's loads of observations to take away at the moment from the property market, loads of news out there. So we're really looking forward to bringing that episode. So make sure you tune in for that one next week.
Okay, just before we get into our main topic, Rob, we've been busy on YouTube again.
We have. We've released a new video, 5 areas we'd never invest in. Yeah, we decided to start annoying people. Well, you could argue that we've been doing that for a long time, but we've really gone out of our way by choosing, or you could say picking on, 5 areas in the UK that we just simply would not invest in. It's a great video because besides possibly amusing you, you actually will learn a lot on why those areas are just no-goes for us. It's 7 minutes long, so it's nice and easy to absorb. If you haven't already subscribed to the Property Hub channel on YouTube, are you mad? It's just all this additional content for free. Go and get it. Search for Property Hub UK, find the channel, subscribe, watch that video. You know what? You'll probably have a better day because of it.
Over the last few months on the Property Podcast, we've remarked that we're in a property boom, but no one really seems to have caught on. It's not been reported much in the media. Well, the media has caught up with the Property Podcast. It always happens eventually. And now, everywhere you go, people are talking about how quickly the property market is rising. And you know, that's going to happen. When the property market is growing by double digits, people are going to comment on it. Now, naturally, when the market is growing that fast, it's a little bit exciting, but it's also a little bit worrying. Does that mean that we are at the top of the market? We know that booms don't go on forever. We know that extremely rapid property price growth tends to come just before a crash. So are we at the top of the market now? That is something that a lot of people are concerned about. A lot of investors are wanting to add to their portfolios. They see opportunities, but they're nervous. They think they could be getting in at the peak because all the media headlines are about all-time highs. Well, if you've been listening over the last few months, you will know that we don't believe that that is the case. We subscribe to a theory called the 18-year property cycle, which tells us that we've got a good few years to go yet. And if you listen to episode 426 of the podcast, we elaborate on that a little bit more. So just to be clear, we don't believe that we are at the top of the market right now. But what if you don't believe us? That's fine. What if you've got your own view? What if you think we are near the top? Well, in this episode, we are going to talk through what buying at the top of the market looks like. If that is your view, what should you be doing? What should you be thinking about? And make sure you listen to the end, because we've got a couple of real case studies about our own investments that we did make near the peak of the market last time round. And we're going to tell you how those performed. And there's lots of lessons to take away from those.
There certainly are. But before we get there, what happens at the top of the market? What will you see? Well, to be honest, it's challenging to spot the signs because we're already in a market that's booming. So you will see some of these things now. Unfortunately, there isn't a signal, a sign that's right now we're at the top. That doesn't exist. But you will see certain trades happening, and you may already, depending on your area, see some of this playing out now. So people are nervous. People are starting to get fearful about the property market itself. Is it going to keep going? But on the other side, people are also greedy. So there's fear and greed playing out, and there's two battles. And greed will be winning until enough people become fearful, and then it overturns and it all comes crashing down. Prices will keep rising, people getting FOMO. You'll hear about properties going for way over asking, sometimes without even being viewed. And these are not investors, these are homeowners who are just getting caught up in the hysteria. Sealed bids is another one you'd expect to see. Agents start to play things to their advantage. And by having sealed bids, which is you putting down your number on what you're willing to pay, means that the vendor is probably going to get more money because people will often go big on that number to make sure they secure the property. So there are a fair few things to look out for. And of course, Rob, people will start to make bad investment decisions. You can make a bad investment decision in any market, but it's a lot easier to do when you're at the top of the market.
Yes, very easy to make bad decisions fueled by this fear of missing out. So it's very easy to get tempted into getting into a bidding war and overpaying. This is how you end up with properties going so much over asking price. We go, well, I might as well pay 20 grand more than the asking price or more than I was planning to now. Because if I wait a couple of months, then that's what it's going to be worth. This is characteristic of a phase of the 18-year property cycle called the winner's curse. It normally refers to the last couple of years in the cycle where property prices are going absolutely mad. And it's a curse because if you are the lucky winner of a property during that time, you will then see its value plummet when things crash afterwards. We've already referred to the 18-year cycle in passing a couple of times during this episode, and I'm sure we'll do it again. So if you're not familiar with it, go to propertyhub.net, search for 18-year cycle, and you'll find lots of resources there, including podcasts, videos, courses. So however you choose to learn about it, well worth doing. Now, at the moment, like you said, Rob, we are seeing some of these characteristics in some parts of the country. We're seeing properties sell over ask very quickly. We're seeing sealed bids. And I think that's part of the reason some people think that we could be at the top of the market because they remember this from last time. If you go back and listen to the episode I referred to earlier, we give our thoughts on why that's not the case right now. But again, let's assume that it is. If you believe that we are approaching the top of the market, what should you be doing? Well, first of all, you should be very cautious about buying. We've talked about that already. But also, Rob, you'd be wanting to think about refinancing the properties you've already got.
Yes, it's time to get your property house in order. And one of the things you may want to consider doing is releasing equity. So it may come as a bit of a surprise if you're new to this, thinking, well, I want to take out more money when it's at the top of the market. But as we've heard from the news story, rates will be very competitive. And therefore, money will still be cheap. And while credit is plentiful during a boom, after a boom, it's not. And credit is hard to get hold of. In fact, after the last crash in 2008, it was very, very difficult to get any sort of buy-to-let mortgage, which really frustrated so many potential investors because there were incredible opportunities available, but they weren't able to take advantage of them because they required people to buy cash. But you could potentially make yourself a cash buyer. If you've got a fair amount of equity in your portfolio, if you've been investing now or you have been, well, then over the next few years, if you haven't got equity, you probably will have just from the price rises. So you can take out money, sit on it, and then deploy it after the crash and get yourself a great deal. Of course, though, if the market doesn't crash, you're sitting on money that you're paying for. And if you're out by a few years, that could become quite a painful exercise. So a great thing to do, but your timing needs to be right. But of course, Rob, you could just not refinance at all and just go with the flow.
Yeah, I think what you've just said is going to sound crazy to a lot of people. So like, you think property prices are going to fall, so you extend your borrowing? Well, in a couple of weeks' time, we've got an episode where we're talking to a mortgage broker about many really interesting subjects, but including this one. So make sure you listen to that. But in short, if property prices do go down, so you go from being 75% loan to value to 85 or 90%, that sounds like a major problem, and it's not ideal, but historically, including last time round, lenders were pretty relaxed about this, as long, big caveat, as you can keep paying the mortgage. In commercial property, you get covenants where you must maintain a certain loan to value, and if you don't, there are big problems. In residential, that tends not to be the case. So you could take the view that getting the equity out of the property while you can, getting your hands on that cash so you can really make the most of it on the other side, is the best thing you can do. But like you just said, Rob, you could just go with the flow instead. If you did that, then effectively you would just have some of your equity wiped out. So say that you originally bought at 75% loan to value, it went down to 60% loan to value. Your loan to value then decreased to 60% because the property had got more expensive, and then it goes back to where it was again. Well, on paper, you've just gained and lost a lot of money, but because you weren't planning to do anything with it, it is just on paper. It's very easy to be relaxed about this kind of thing if you understand the 18-year property cycle. If you understand that over the very long term, the market always ends up higher than it has been in the past, then you can be relaxed about having limited equity or no equity. You can be relaxed about losing money on paper for a while because you believe it's going to come back again. And you can understand why that's always been the case in the past and it should be the case in the future. I think a lot of the fear around buying at the top of the market is that you are buying at literally the worst point ever and you're never going to be able to recover from it. And don't get me wrong, it's far better not to buy at the top of the market. But as we'll see later, time in property is a great healer.
I think it's worth having a quick note on the rental market because in a boom, we're obviously talking about property prices a lot. So do rents boom as well the same way? Well, the quick answer is no, they don't. Rents are far less volatile. The good news is while they don't rocket up, they also don't collapse as well. Over the long term, the rental market closely follows inflation. And another sign of the market being really peaky is that yields pretty much everywhere are rubbish because rents haven't gone up in line with property prices. And then you tend to find people chasing the yield, which is looking at areas that are probably not being normally your first choice type of property, and buying in excitedly because they can still get some sort of a yield. But what happens is after the crash and everyone comes back to their senses, you've realised that you've actually bought in a pretty rubbish area and you're going to be paying for it in one way or another. But at least you'll have some yield to get you through it and some rental return. So it's not all doom and gloom. Now, like Rob said, it's very easy. If you believe in the 18-year property cycle, you understand it, that you can be quite calm throughout this process. But actually, even the most savvy investors, the ones who've been through this before, they've seen previous cycles play out, still will feel some sort of emotion around the events because we said, yes, the media is starting to talk about the property market now, but they will talk about it so much more. And people will be talking about the property market like they do about Bitcoin because everyone will start to think that they can make money quickly from property. So, Rob, we can say how you should react. Obviously, living through it and dealing with your mental game is easier said than done. But how should investors navigate these waters? How should they be thinking and acting during this time?
I'd say there are two things, both of which definitely fall into the easier said than done category. But the first, which is a really important one, is to keep your discipline. So not overpaying for a property, not getting caught up in those bidding wars that will be going on, but also, like you said, Rob, not chasing yield into areas that you really won't want to be in a few years' time. So keeping that discipline, keeping your head when all those around you are losing theirs is really important. The other thing you can do is take this as an opportunity. So if you've got properties in your portfolio that in retrospect you probably wouldn't buy again, maybe they're not performing for you, maybe your strategy has changed and they're not suitable for you anymore, this frenzied point of the market is the perfect time to offload. Investors will be in the market, open occupiers will be in the market, and because there's so much of a frenzy and supply is always limited, your property that you're not that keen on anymore is going to look attractive to a lot of people, and you'll be able to get a better price for it now than you will be for a very, very long time. So doing that portfolio review can be a really valuable exercise. And if you do take the opportunity to streamline your portfolio a little bit, offload those properties that haven't been performing for you, well, then that's great. That achieves a couple of things. Firstly, it reduces your loan to value across your portfolio. And secondly, it leaves you with cash, which you can then potentially sit on, wait out the madness, and then on the other side, when the crash comes, you'll be in a great position to go out and spend it on properties that you do actually want at a far better price.
Okay, so here's the part that we've all been waiting for. The lessons that you can take from 2008. And we're going to look at some really interesting numbers now. So how can you come out a winner from this process? Because you really can. Although this all sounds scary and like, oh, I want to avoid that at all costs. In fact, if you get it right, you can be investing way into this market cycle and still come out all right. But if you make a bad pick as well, then it actually isn't as bad as you might think. Rather than opinions, let's look at some numbers. So Rob, let's talk about an investment you made before the last market crash.
Yes, this is an interesting one because on paper, I bought it at one of the worst times you possibly could have bought. I didn't know about the cycle back then. Give me a break. So I'm not going to use the actual numbers for the property that I bought because I don't know what it's worth today. So I'm going to use land registry figures for the area that the property is in, which is Islington in London, and use that to illustrate the point. So I bought this property in October 2006. Now, of course, I didn't know this at the time, but this was exactly 1 year before the market peaked in London, which is in October 2007. So I bought in 2006, where the average price for the area was £336,000. 1 year later, at the local peak, October 2007, the average price was £419,000. Really amazing growth in that year. But then, of course, that was the peak. Things didn't go so well after that, and the low point for the area then came in January 2009. So it took a year and a bit to go from peak to trough, and the low point was £329,000. So the thing that amazed me when going back and looking at this data was that I bought a year before the crash, which should be well into the winner's curse, not a time that you want to be buying property. But even at the absolute low point of the trough a couple of years later, it only ended up being worth very slightly less than I'd paid for it. So the low point was 329 and the purchase price was 336. Now, the other amazing thing about London last time round was how quickly it bounced back. So the trough was in January 2009. By October 2009, the London market had picked up again. So the price by October 2009 was about 40 grand higher. It was up to £371,000. And 10 years after my original purchase, so October 2016, the average price was £634,000. So it virtually doubled over that 10-year period, even though the original purchase had been right up to the peak of the market. Now, I think there are some important lessons and observations in there, Rob, but maybe before we get into those, we should hear about one of your investments from around that time, because there's a bit of a contrast there.
Quite a bit, unfortunately. If you didn't know about the 18-year property cycle, I'm about to demonstrate that at this point in time. I certainly didn't. So a few months later, after you made your purchase, I made a purchase in the north of England on the Wirral for just over 100,000. And the market crashed like it did everywhere else. And in this particular area of the Wirral, the prices went down by about 20%. So not too dissimilar to what we've heard so far. But here's the big difference. A few years later, prices still hadn't moved, still down 20%. 10 years later, there'd been some improvement, but still they were worth less than they were at the peak, which meant I was still in negative equity a decade on. And amazingly, it's only in the last 12 months that it's now worth more than what I purchased it for. So again, some great lessons we can take from that. But before we get to them, let's just look at the average. So Rob's done well there. I clearly did less well. But what if you just buy an average investment in an average area and then you go through a market crash? What plays out then?
Well, I've taken the UK average and I've identified the worst point in recent history that you possibly could have bought the UK average property. So the peak for the UK as a whole came slightly after the London peak that I was talking about earlier. But for the UK, January 2008, when the average property cost £185,000. So you go out and you buy that property, and then a year later, you really wish you hadn't, because a year later, by January 2009, it was worth £157,000. So that is a 15% decrease. We know that 15% was the average amount that came off the property market last time round. So not good, but that's okay. You can keep on holding. You're a long-term investor. And by January 2018, so 10 years after that initial purchase, the average UK property was worth £224,000. So that means that after those 10 years, that property is worth 21% more than you paid for it. Now, 21% growth over 10 years, so averaging just over 2% a year, is not great. It's half of what it would have been if you'd bought it at the best time, but that's not bad, Rob, considering that you bought it at the worst possible time you could have bought. It's not just being a little bit unlucky, it's not buying in the middle of the cycle, it's buying at the absolute worst time.
Yeah, so picking the worst month in an 18-year cycle, it's pretty harsh. But of course, some people would have invested then. But even so, you still would be up 21% over that time period. So let's look at the lessons. What about my investment? Do I regret it? I mean, maybe think, yes, of course, you must regret that. You know what? I don't. Because actually, interest rates dropped after the crash. They were slashed. And my mortgage then went on to something called a standard variable rate, which is the rate that you will go on to after your initial fixed term. But fortunately, and many others benefited from this as well, the standard variable rate was a number pegged to interest rates. And because interest rates were so low, it meant that my mortgage also dropped. So my return increased dramatically. So over the years, I've never been tempted to sell it because it's just paid me rent month in, month out. So in terms of capital growth, okay, if I sold now, I'd be slightly up. Certainly nothing to write home about. I'm not going to win any Investment of the Year awards on that one. But we've given you an example here of a worst case scenario. Mine was, an area that dropped more than the average, took way longer than the average to recover, but yet it still wasn't that bad.
Yeah, looking at these two examples next to each other, you really see how much location matters. Because London bounced back really fast. And London was an anomaly. The rest of the country took a long time to catch up. But even now, there are still some parts of the country that are a fair bit below where they were at the last peak. And that's because the cycle moves at different paces across the country. And it tends to be the case that the strongest areas, economically the strongest in terms of employment and things like that, tend to recover fastest. And that's another reason why you don't want to start chasing yield towards the top of the cycle like Rob was talking about earlier, because you could end up chasing that yield into an area that's fundamentally pretty weak, which means not only do you end up in an area that's not that exciting, if the market does then crash, you could be in an area that takes a long time for the market to come back. If you're getting paid rent the whole time, well, that's not so bad, but there is a significant opportunity cost there. The other point that I found really striking when looking at my example in London was just how short the winner's curse is. So if you look at the 18-year property cycle, it's generally considered to be the 2 years or so leading up to the peak. But in my case, I only bought 1 year before the peak, but still it had so much growth in that year after that point that when the market crashed, it only dipped slightly below what it was worth at the outset. And that just really shows how boomy the boom tends to be. That last year, property prices go really crazy. And that shows just how important and how difficult timing the market is. For example, if you believe that we were coming to the top of the market now, but actually you were wrong by even just 2-3 years, you could miss out in an immense amount of growth in that time. So even if you missed out on a couple of great years and then you missed out on the crash as well, you might still have been better off if you'd got involved in the first place. Now, of course, Rob, this is all a lot easier said than done. It's fine to go and see all these patterns looking back, and it's fine to go, oh, well, if you've done this, if you've done that. We know that next time is not going to be exactly like last time. The growth's not going to happen at the same point. The percentage drops are not going to be the same. It's not even necessarily going to be the same parts of the country that come back fastest. But I still think looking back at these real examples is very helpful. And I also think that looking at the UK average and deliberately choosing the worst timed investment is helpful, because it should make you feel a lot more relaxed, make you really appreciate the long-term power of property.
It really should. And we've touched on it a few times during this episode, but I think it's worth repeating that you will also be paid to own this property during this period. So, of course, the real wealth in property is made through capital growth, and lots of people are becoming wealthier right now through the property market. But through all parts of the property cycle, you will be paid a rent. As long as it's rented out, which if you've bought in a half-decent area and the rent's priced at the right level, then it will. So if you can just emotionally forget about a property that may end up dipping at some point, because you know over the long term it will recover, and then enjoy that income through the tougher years, you know what? I know what I'd be rather doing if the choice was between investing or not. As we said at the beginning of the show, for the record, we do not think we're at the top of the cycle. We do not think we're there. We're a number of years away from that. But if you have a different opinion and you think we're there now, at least we've given you some guidance today on how to approach it. And what's really interesting is that the lessons that we've talked about over the years don't change. Buy in a good area, buy good properties in good areas, stick it out for the long term, and you'll probably do great. So it's time for Hub Extra now, and Rob, this resource I haven't looked at yet, and you were about to tell me before we started recording what your resource is, but actually we thought, well, let's just do it on the podcast. So Rob, what is our Hub Extra resource?
Well, it's nothing that's going to help you with how to time your investments. It's nothing that's going to help you with investing or anything practical really at all. It's just a really good piece of entertainment. This is a TV show called Ted Lasso. You can watch it on Apple TV, and it's a comedy about an American football coach who gets hired to manage a British Premier League team despite having no experience, absolutely no understanding of the rules of the game at all. And it just follows how that goes. It sounds like a really stupid concept, and it is. It's quite a daft program, but it is really, really funny and quite emotional in a lot of places as well. So if you're getting stressed out about the property market and you're just looking for a really easy, feel-good watch, I absolutely thoroughly recommend it.
Awesome. I needed a new show to start, Rob, so thank you very much. Hiring managers that have no clue what they're doing. Sounds like a documentary about Spurs, but I'll give it a watch and we'll see. Okay, so that's us done for another week. As we've said, we'll be back next week with the market update, so do not miss that episode. You want to keep your finger firmly on the pulse of the property market right now, understand exactly what's happening, and we'll make sure that you're in that place by the end of next week's episode. Between now and next Thursday, you can also enjoy Ask Rob and Rob or go and check out our YouTube channel, Property Hub UK. So plenty to keep you busy with. We'll be back with you soon. Take care. Have fun. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.